What language are we doing this in? Iraqi dialect. Good to have you here.
Good to be here.
So before we get started, I just wanted to ask, are you still a fan of John Cusack? Or
Yeah, isn't that amazing? It's not on.
I think his mic's not working.
Let me see. Is this better? Yeah,
Better.
there we go. Well, you know, that's a perfect example of what we're dealing with, right? I mean, it's constant. It's a drumbeat everywhere you look, everywhere you turn, everywhere you go, and from every angle, from every part of the community, from every angle. And that's a perfect example of what we're up against.
And that's a perfect example of what can be done to stop that type of activity.
Well, condemnation. I mean, look, he was subjected to rounding condemnation from you know, many sources. And I think that's a very, very important lesson, because in the United States, where anti-Semitic speech is often protected under the First Amendment, the answer is not censorship. We don't do that, but the answer has to be condemnation. Often we don't see enough of it, but there has to be resounding condemnation. And here, by the way, Yaakov, the distinction between, and I want to compliment Tzachi for your excellent presentation, this distinction, supposedly, between the old traditional anti-Semitism and the so-called new anti-Semitism, I would argue there's nothing new about it, is particularly dangerous here, because, you know, nowadays you call yourself an anti-Semite and they run you out of town. Call yourself an anti-Zionist and you get tenure.
Right.
And so really the issue is the widespread acceptance in many circles, or slightly better but not good enough, the reluctance to condemn in the same way the anti-Semitism that, when it is aimed at Zionism or the State of Israel, is extremely dangerous for all of us, because in effect it gives a green light to anti-Semites and it allows themselves to conceal their activities under this fig leaf of anti-Zionism and Israel hatred, whereas in fact it's Jew hatred. That's what this is. It's Jew hatred, and it needs to be called out and condemned resoundingly wherever it appears.
Well, I think everyone here would agree with that. But you're seeing it manifest and so many different levels in so many different places. So you have John Cusack with his tweeting. You had the neo-Nazis who interrupted the Pride March and then violated the Israeli flag while they were there, right? So it's coming. And then you have Poway in Pittsburgh. So in your position, when you're looking at the gamut of what you're facing, what are the different tools that you actually have in place that can, besides condemnation, besides for using this amazing room of people who can tweet back at someone like John Cusack, what can be done?
Well, what can be done is to implement policies that are focused at fighting this. So, you know, for example, I just returned from a trip to Europe where I sat down representing the United States in bilateral meetings in several countries, and we discussed, and again, I don't want to get into confidences, but we discussed specific developments in these countries. And we said, look, you're doing great things, A, B, C, D, we appreciate it, thank you, but now let's talk about, you know, these other issues that we need to work on. And I will tell you, and I'm thrilled to be able to report to all of you, that the message has gone out that not only do I care about this, of course I'm the envoy on anti-Semitism, so I should, but the message has gone out that Secretary Pompeo, my boss, cares about this, and his boss cares about this. And when every country I visit knows that the President of the United States and the Secretary of State are deeply committed to this issue, let me tell you, when I make a request, they do everything they can to accommodate me, because they know that this is the policy of the United States. And so the tools are, first of all, diplomatic tools, where we make specific, focused requests of our allies around the world to deal with specific issues in those countries. And second of all, we use the bully pulpit of the United States to seek to implement policies that will address these issues. I'm happy to report that a BDS bill is going to almost certainly now we know is going to get a vote in Congress. It's going to come out of committee and it's going to be voted on. And
do you know when that will happen?
No, but it will happen. I've been assured it will happen, and this is incredibly important. I mean, when you see, I mean, why did the German Bundestag vote the way it voted. Tzachi and I were talking about it earlier. I call it, when I speak about this, an earthquake. That didn't just happen. People didn't just wake up one day and say, well, let's now condemn BDS and call it anti-Semitic. It happened because the United States, the State of Israel, and Jewish organizations that are doing incredibly important work in this issue are making the case, and making the case better than we've ever made the case before. And I'll point out, by the way, that the German Bundestag decision wasn't only that BDS is anti-Semitic. They said it is reminiscent of the Juden boycotts. And this is an amazing statement when Germany, and they ought to know, says that BDS today is basically a recycled, repackaged version of Kauft nicht bei Juden. This is a game changer in our field, and it happened because of the work of many in this room, and the State of Israel, and the United States. And so I think with all the bad news out there, and there's no shortage of that, Yaakov, as you know, as we all know, there is a lot of good news out there, and I, if I weren't optimistic, I wouldn't have taken this job.
So but let me ask you, you mentioned Europe. 9 out of 10 Jews in Europe are saying that anti-Semitism is getting worse in their countries, right? All polls pretty much show the same trend. As the son of Iraqi immigrants, I don't know if your father had one of those sticks that Tzachi's father walked around with, but maybe there's a time, just like Jews in Iraq eventually had to leave and had to come to Israel or elsewhere around the world, maybe the same is the verdict on Europe.
Well, maybe, but and obviously I'm not going to make a statement against Zionism or against Aliyah, but I will tell you that that the governments in Europe are deeply troubled by that survey. This was the Fundamental Rights Agency of the EU, the FRA survey, that found that some 80 to 90% of Jews regard anti-Semitism as an urgent problem and rising in their country. And another statistic, a third of those are thinking of leaving the country. The Europeans are deeply troubled by this. I just literally yesterday returned from a conference in Bucharest. More good news is that Europeans find this unacceptable, disgraceful, and actually embarrassing. That 75 years after the crematoria stopped operating, literally 75 years, we're commemorating this January, 75 years of the liberation of Auschwitz, that in Europe, Jews are afraid to leave their houses, are afraid for the safety of their kids, are afraid to go in the streets wearing kippot, is a disgrace. And Europeans know it's a disgrace, and they're saying it's a disgrace. And so this is incredibly important when you've got leaders at all levels, from heads of state and government to parliamentarians to mayors and governors and local leaders who are saying, we have to stop this. In fact, a non-Jewish leader just said the other day, I was with him the other day, he said, this is a non-Jewish leader, said, if this is about containment, never mind managing a decline, if this is only about containment, we've lost, we've failed. This has to be about rolling back anti-Semitism and about winning. This is a non-Jewish European leader. And they get it, these leaders, and this is what's very important. They understand that anti-Semitism isn't only about the Jews. It is certainly about the Jews, but it is so much more. Anti-Semitism is human history's greatest barometer of suffering and misery. And President Trump calls it a vile poison because it really is. Every society that has imbibed this poison has rotted to its core and produced human misery at a level that defies description. And so the stakes of this fight, Yaakov, the stakes is nothing other than the future of our societies, the future, the world that our children will inherit. That's what is at stake. And I'm so pleased that European leaders are speaking in those terms, and they're saying it's not only about protecting the Jews, although that would be enough, morally, enough reason to do it. It's about the future of our countries, our continent, our societies. That's what's at stake. They get it, and they're fighting it. And my job as the senior representative of the United States on this issue is not only to go after and call out and shame the anti-Semites and pressure the recalcitrant, but this is very important. My job also is to support with the full weight of the United States our friends and allies who get it and who are fighting this fight and making a difference. And that's exactly what we're doing.
But for every good story, there's also sadly bad stories. So the Bundestag in Germany passes the bill, right, saying that BDS is anti-Semitism, and then you have someone, your colleague there, Felix Klein, who comes out and says Jews shouldn't walk around. I can't guarantee, or Jews should not walk around with kippot. Did you talk to him after that? I mean,
Well, no, because I was with him yesterday. He walked that back, and by the way, he meant well. Obviously, I don't defend the statement, but this happens a lot. People say that a lot, and not only non-Jews but Jews. I mean, a friend of mine was just in France, and it's an Orthodox family, and a Jewish woman, and ran up to them and literally with tears in her eyes, crying, openly crying, said, please take the kippot off the heads of your kids. Please don't endanger your children. So, they mean well, and Felix meant well. Obviously, it's an unacceptable response to anti-Semitism to say Jews should hide who they are. That's obviously not acceptable. He saw that and walked it back. But the point is that we have got to make Jews feel secure. And that gets me to the benchmarks that we use to measure success. One of the things I just did in Bucharest is all of us who deal with anti-Semitism around the world talked about having the same deliverables, coming together and measuring success in the same way, which would really be a force multiplier for each other's work. I think, my view is, that among the many benchmarks that I think we ought to be using, a key has to be, do Jews feel safer? Are we moving the needle on that? Because for all the manifestations of anti-Semitism, the ultimate toll is on the psychology of the Jewish community. The survey that you talked about, Yaakov, when Jews are afraid to leave their house or afraid to send their kids to school, you can't have quality of life if you're not safe. You can't. And so I think bottom line, a benchmark has to be, are we moving the needle, and do Jews feel safer and more secure? Among other benchmarks that I think are very important, such as, for example, a major issue, Tzachi, also you mentioned, excellent, I'm glad you mentioned it, is textbooks. For me, if a country is indoctrinating anti-Semitic venom in children, first of all, that's child abuse, no question. Let's call it what it is, it's child abuse. But second of all, it becomes so difficult to undo the damage. And countries that are doing that are ensuring an entire generation of anti-Semites. That, for me, is a red line, and that's why, by the way, the United States has defunded UNRWA and pulled out, because we will not collude with any organization that is putting money in funding anti-Semitic indoctrination of children. And this is going to be a key benchmark for us, because if a country is producing textbooks that are anti-Semitic, that has got to stop.
What do you think also about, and last question on Europe here for a moment, some countries in Europe, like Poland as an example, passing legislation that seems aimed at whitewashing history, coming out against Jews being able for property restitution. So on the one hand, and these are countries that Israel needs to work with, these are countries that America needs to continue to work with, but at the same time they're pushing policies, legislation, creating an atmosphere that leads to anti-Semitism.
Yeah. So there's no question that's correct. And I just returned from a trip to Poland, Hungary, and Ukraine. And we had very candid discussions about things like the IPN law, which you just referenced, and the Just Act, which is a big issue in Poland, and the House of Fates Museum in Hungary, and various other things, the resurrection of Bandera in Ukraine. And there are all these issues. I will tell you that what is going on in Central and Eastern Europe, although certainly not perfect and certainly problematic, and there's certainly issues we need to work on, is quite miraculous. When you see Jewish life flourishing in Budapest, and I mean flourishing, Jews walking around with kippot. I took a taxi, I was speaking at a synagogue, I took a taxi to a synagogue, the cab driver, certainly not Jewish, says, have a good Shabbat. I asked about kosher food in a store, and a woman said, no, unfortunately, we don't sell kosher food. Again, not Jewish, but she told me what store I can find it. I mean, just amazing. In Poland, the Jewish festival in Krakow and the encouragement that the government is putting. By the way, the Peace Party in Poland is doing more to refurbish and clean up Jewish cemeteries than any previous Polish government. Hungary is also putting money into synagogues and helping synagogues. Ukraine just elected a Jewish president. And what is more amazing than the election of a Jewish president is this, and I've, by the way, followed this, including with classified intelligence briefings. It never came up. The Jewishness of Zelensky never came up in the campaign. How many countries can you say where a sitting incumbent president is down by 30 points in the polls to a Jewish challenger, and the Jewishness of the challenger was never raised? I mean, I'm not sure it wouldn't be raised in the United States under those circumstances. So it's amazing. Now, are they whitewashing their history? Are they resurrecting war criminals and paying homage to them? No question. We had those discussions. I told them that it is unacceptable for that to happen. I had very candid discussions. And my basic approach to these countries is, look, you're doing so many things right. Don't screw it up. Let us help you tell the great story about what you're doing. Don't adopt these measures that sabotage all the good things you're doing and make us question what it is you're doing. So I'm hopeful that we can improve things in these countries. And I will say, by the way, that there was a piece of legislation that was about to be introduced in Poland that not only didn't meet Poland's obligations under the declaration where they were supposed to deal with Holocaust restitution, but this was legislation that said, on the contrary, we're not paying a penny. They dropped it. This was legislation that was going to be introduced. They dropped the legislation. The IPN law, which was a criminal penalty, was downgraded to civil only, and that's not sufficient, but it's an improvement. The House of Fates plan that was just unveiled in Hungary includes an entire piece dedicated to the numerus clausus, the Nuremberg-type laws of Horthy before the Nazi occupation, which was in doubt. And so all of these things are incremental, gradual improvements, and we've got to make sure to work with these countries to see these improvements come to fruition.
The comparison between Europe and what's happening now in the United States, Pittsburgh, Poway, I just spent Shabbat in a synagogue in Long Island, armed security guards on each corner of the block, right? So this is obviously something that's happening. Would you recommend that every synagogue in America now needs security?
Well, yeah, I think that, my kids are in a Jewish day school, and we just had this debate. We had guards, they weren't armed, and the parents were up in arms, pun intended. And now they are armed. And I think, look, we live in a time of danger. By the way, look at the active shooter situations in the United States. It's not only anti-Semitism, right? So yes, I would say any synagogue and any school,
JCC, school,
every JCC, I think should have guards. God willing, may they never be needed, but they should be there, first of all. Second of all, I will say this, and this is very important. The United States is the most philo-Semitic country in the history of the world. There are real problems. There is a growing anti-Semitic movement. Obviously, the far right is extremely dangerous. Pittsburgh and Poway. I spoke at the funeral of Lori Kay, Zichronah Livracha, in Poway, and I spoke there not only on behalf of my agency, the Department of State. I was asked by the White House to represent the entire administration and to say what I said, which is, on behalf of the United States, we are at war with ethnic supremacists. I was authorized to say that, and that is the policy of this administration. And so there's no question that there's a growing danger from the far right. There's also a disastrous tidal wave of anti-Semitism on college campuses in America. This is a clear and present danger to the future of the Jewish community, and it has to be addressed, and we're working internally in the United States to address that, working with other agencies. But despite all of that, and despite all the issues and all of the things we need to fix, the United States doesn't tolerate Jews. We talk about tolerance as the great virtue of our age. Jews aren't tolerated in America. Jews are treasured in the United States, embraced, loved, and so I think that really the Jewish community in the United States is blessed, and that hasn't changed with Pittsburgh and Poway, but we have to make sure to be vigilant so that the most philo-Semitic country in history doesn't change its love for the Jewish people.
Some people might say that the political rhetoric on both sides, coming not only from the left, but also from the right and even from the president himself, is contributing to this rise.
Well, the rhetoric of the president couldn't be clearer. Every time President Trump talks about this, he calls it a vile poison that we must root out from our midst. After the Pittsburgh shooting, in a MAGA rally in Illinois, literally hours after the Pittsburgh shooting. He said something that few leaders in the history of the world have said, which is, if you go after the Jews, we're coming after you. Namely, if you seek the destruction of the Jewish people, the United States will seek your destruction. That is a staggering thing to say for a president of the United States. He means it, and Vice President Pence couldn't be clearer. John Bolton couldn't be clearer. My boss, Secretary Pompeo, is one of the best friends we could possibly have on this issue. And I'm not even talking about Jared Kushner and Jason Greenblatt and David Friedman, and the list goes on and on. So I think that this administration couldn't be clearer. Now, I will say this. Is there a pathological ethnic supremacist right in America? Sure, and they're dangerous. Is there an anti-Zionist left in America? Sure, and they're dangerous. That's why we have to come together and fight this shoulder to shoulder and arm in arm as one. We are one, right? It's a good motto, Tzachi. We are one. And it's very important. I never rank. I mean, we can talk about the different flavors. You know, you've got anti-Semitism from the ethnic supremacist right, from the anti-Zionist left, from radical Islam. They're all bad. I never rank them. And the reason why I don't rank them in importance is, first of all, that does injustice to the fight that we need to fight, number one. And second of all, it inevitably exacerbates the political fragmentation we see in the United States and frankly in Israel as well. And we don't need to exacerbate that. We need to make this fight a joint, bipartisan fight that basically all decent people, Jewish and non-Jewish, need to do together. What I say is this: I don't care what ideological clothing it wears. Jew hatred is Jew hatred. And we need to fight it. We need to oppose it. Whether it's right, left, or Islamic, we need to fight it. And that's got to be the message. This is not about right, left, Democrat, Republican, or, you know, majority in government versus opposition in Israel. We have to be 100% united in fighting Jew hatred, whether it's directed against Jews in a community or the Jew among the states.
So let's talk about the left, though, for one moment. You have people, congressmen, inside the U.S. Congress who are spewing anti-Semitism today. Ilhan Omar is one recent example, and the failure of the House to be able to pass a resolution that would single out anti-Semitism had to pool it all together with other forms of hatred. And just even last night, I think it was, Ocasio-Cortez on Twitter is talking about the concentration camps that the administration, what was her quote? They're running concentration camps on our southern border. That's exactly what they are. They are concentration camps. So just the use of something that was unique, sadly, to the Jewish people, now throwing that around. What do you say to all that?
Well, very painful, very painful. But I think what we have to ask is, why is it that these freshman members of Congress feel that they can express themselves that way? And this really gets to a much broader problem. I mean, the real problem is what's going on college campuses in the United States. And I got to tell you something. I mean, as bad as you think it is, it's worse. Eric knows. Eric actually just had to walk out, but Eric knows. It is, and David certainly knows, it is worse than you might think it is. It is unvarnished, naked anti-Semitism directed against Jewish and pro-Israel students. And what is particularly dangerous is that it is working. And here's what I want to talk about, and this really answers the questions about members of Congress in an indirect way. A survey was just done of Jewish college students in the United States. And the results are alarming. Jewish kids on college campuses are less supportive of Israel than ever before, more inclined to blame Israel for the problems in the Middle East than ever before, and more inclined to be sympathetic with Palestinian terrorism. Not only that, but Robert Stearns is here of just an amazing, Eagle's Wings, and just amazing, an Israel Christian Nexus, amazing pastor. And we were talking about this in New York and actually this morning. It is the topic of conversation in the Christian world that Christians are losing the next generation. Robert calls it a crisis. It's a crisis in the Christian world. Well, let me tell you a story. I was just at a pro-Israel rally where I spoke in Los Angeles a few weeks ago. And this evangelical Christian kid runs up to me and he says, I really liked your speech and I'm here. I love Israel. I'm a Christian Zionist. And I said to him, tell me something. Young kid, I said, tell me something. Is it true that young evangelicals are less supportive of Israel than ever before? This kid says to me, oh, it's absolutely true. It's all around us. I said, tell me, Matthew, why is that? You know what he said to me? He said, because we also go to college. We also hear it all the time. This is what's happening. It is a constant drumbeat of anti-Semitism on college campuses. And if Jews and evangelicals are being affected, just think of everyone else. But that's just not too great. That's our base. Jewish kids and evangelical kids are being turned. That's the danger we face. And so when you look at young members of Congress who weren't in college that long ago, right. This is what we have to fix. And if we don't fix it, it's going to be too late. Let me tell you, I have to, I'm sorry to run on here, but I want to tell you about the single most disturbing meeting I've had since I've been on this job for 4.5 months. And I've had many unpleasant meetings in this line of work, as you might imagine, but this one stands out. I met with a UK Labour MP who walked out of the Labour Party, not Jewish, amazingly brave leader, who walked out of her lifelong Labour Party because she said, I will not sit at the same table with anti-Semites. And she said to me in a meeting I had, my hair stood on end. She said, this disaster we have in England all started on the campuses. And we did nothing because they were just students. And then it moved into the Labour Party. And we did nothing because it was just the left-wing fringe. And today they won, we lost, and I no longer have a political party. That's what we face today. And so what I ask of all of you in this room is, now is the time, not tomorrow. There won't be a tomorrow. Now is the time for us to stand together unequivocally without any political divisions among us and fight what is an absolute danger to our survival, and fight it together and fight it ferociously.
So we have to take some questions from the audience, but just before that, BDS violates the State Department's definition of anti-Semitism. Can you take action on college campuses?
Well, 100%, and we're working with the Department of Education to do exactly that. BDS is anti-Semitic. Again, the German Bundestag said it, we know it, and that's something that we've got to confront. Again, in the United States, we've got a First Amendment. So there are kinds of anti-Semitism that are protected. Even the Nazis could march in Skokie, right? But campuses are different. Campuses are different. There are laws, Title VI affects the climate on college campuses. So there are things we can do with regard to campuses that we can't do in other places. And this is something we are working on and urgently need to confront.
Okay. We have time for some questions. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the shame that European governments feel as a result of the anti-Semitism, and you've also mentioned the British Labour Party, who may well be the governing party in the UK in a fairly short time. Secretary Pompeo was quoted last week as saying that the US government will not sit by if Jews in Britain feel threatened. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, yes. I mean, there's no question about that, and Secretary Pompeo couldn't be clearer. Look, we're not going to. I'm not going to answer hypotheticals about who may or may not be elected in the United Kingdom. Obviously, politics are a little bit complicated there these days. But regardless of who the Prime Minister is, the United States will insist in the strongest possible terms that our allies not only respect the Jewish people living in their midst and respect the State of Israel, but like I said before, treasure their Jewish communities and treasure the State of Israel. That is something we deeply want to see continue in the United Kingdom, a country that has been a wonderful ally of Israel, and Theresa May couldn't have been any clearer about the Jewish community and how important it is that the United Kingdom stand with the Jewish community. And that is something we expect to continue in the United Kingdom.
Andy?
Thanks so much, Alon, for being here. One of the things that my organization does, API, as you know,
My organization too, I think.
Calls out these tenured professors that are virulently anti-Israel, and also recently at NYU, where the university president literally hid behind First Amendment. What can we do to push the Department of Education to move these processes along?
Right. So Andy's question was, and Andy knows this really from firsthand experience, decades as the executive director of AEPI, the International Jewish Fraternity, where 10,000 AEPI students around the world fight this every day and really are on the front lines of this war. And that's what it is. Let's call it what it is. This is a war on college campuses. And Andy's question is, what can we do about calling out professors who are basically pushing anti-Semitic doctrines? They hide behind the First Amendment. That's exactly right. And let's take an example of that, Andy. Perfect example is the chancellor at UCLA. They host the National SJP conference at UCLA. And then instead of giving an unequivocal condemnation, the chancellor gave a half condemnation and talked about, well, you know, there's free speech and the First Amendment, and I might not agree with everything they say, but you know, if this were a KKK rally, or if this were an anti-Hispanic national conference, first of all, UCLA would not host it. First Amendment or no First Amendment, they wouldn't host it. Second of all, if they had to host it, if hosting it were imposed upon them somehow, the chancellor would have made a statement so unvarnished and so clear, it would have been unmistakable. He would have called it despicable. He would have said, we had no choice, but this is despicable, disgusting, has no place in America. That's the kind of language and rhetoric he would have used. Why is it that when it comes to Israel hatred, there is this hand-wringing response, and it's free speech, and we don't want to limit free speech. Listen, this is why I'm talking about unequivocal condemnation. Even protected speech can be condemned. It's not a violation of the First Amendment to condemn anti-Semitism. Let's get it through everyone's heads, and we've got to do that. We've got to do that. When it happens, we have to stand up together. And those of your organizations that actually or by reputation are seen as left of center, you are more important than anyone else. Because I always say we should be faster to call out anti-Semitism that comes from our side of the ideological spectrum than the other side. And so it should be the left first to say this is disgraceful, despicable, we oppose it. We should be demanding of everybody the strongest condemnation of BDS, the strongest pieces of legislation, not the weaker pieces of legislation. All of us need to be together on this, shoulder to shoulder, because that's how we're going to win this fight, standing together. The way, by the way, to your question, look at what happened when the Jews of England put aside their differences, stood together, and published a joint editorial, 3 competing newspapers. We stand united. It was unprecedented. They said, Jeremy Corbyn threatens the survival and the safety of the Jewish people. The Jewish community stood united and said that. And look what's happened. There's a civil war in the Labour Party. Unity is extremely powerful, and we need it. And so this room is so important because if we stand together shoulder to shoulder and fight this together and put aside any difference we have on any other issue, we will roll this back and we will win.
Mr. Carr, my name is Marcos Becker from Colombia. We might sometimes need the help from the United States, so this is a practical question. Is there any way we can report anti-Semitic severe problems to you or candidates that promote anti-Semitism so that the United States moves with your office to help us?
100%. I get reports all the time. My staff actually filters all kinds of reports on anti-Semitic events all around the world. And in addition to staying focused on long-term, the long game and strategy, a lot of what we do is react to anti-Semitic incidences, anti-Semitic candidates and leaders, and 100%. We have absolutely, my office needs to have these reports, and we welcome these reports from around the world.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Yes?
Yeah, my name is Max Meyer. I'm from Danish Science Federation. I sit here. I just want to ask you, in Denmark, the government in Denmark have long time tried to forbid to make Brit Milah. We want to be the first country in Europe to stop to make circumcision for boys.
Tell me what country again?
Denmark.
Denmark.
Denmark. And want to ask you, Edan, I call it antisemitism, that they want to stop to make Brit Milah, they want to stop to not make shechting as a kosher meat more. And one way I want to ask if somebody can help, I believe if Denmark get the first country, then all Europe countries will come after and say we make it human right, we make it for the child, we don't make it for antisemitism, but for me, you cannot be Jewish in Denmark, you cannot be Jewish in Europe if you cannot make the Brit Milah, you cannot make kosher meat.
Right, so first of all, yes, 100%. About kosher meat, Denmark already bans shechita, as the rest of Scandinavia does. Also, Flanders bans shechita. And I was just in Antwerp speaking to the Council of European Rabbis. What I said there publicly on camera is that banning shechita, and certainly banning Brit Milah, is nothing less than the forced expulsion of the Jewish community of that country. That's going to be my message. I've taken that message already in a very public way that was widely covered. It's going to be my message when I go to Scandinavia. It was my message in Belgium. And I will tell you that the United States is operating intensively on this issue. In fact, you should know that Iceland came very close to banning Brit Milah in Iceland. The United States intervened ferociously on this issue, and Iceland dropped it and has not banned Brit Milah. We are relentless on this issue. This is not only a fight against anti-Semitism, but really this is a core principle of religious freedom. We are about to host, to show you how important religious freedom is to this administration and to my boss, Secretary Pompeo is hosting a ministerial level conference on international religious freedom next month. I'm going to be there. We're presenting a whole panel on anti-Semitism, but ministers, particularly foreign ministers from around the world, will be arriving to Washington to talk about religious freedom. And believe me, bans on Brit Milah and Shechita, which are unacceptable, is going to be a big topic of conversation.
Elon, thank you very much. Thank you.